My name is Chad Etzel. I'm the host of the 8th Day Coaching Podcast. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm also a trained and certified leadership coach, and my goal is to help you overcome stress and master your time, your money, and your God-inspired future. Now, typically this podcast is about leadership coaching, but I've been encouraged by a number of my friends, a number of the people that I've talked to apply these leadership coaching principles into our personal lives. And specifically with this new series, I'm calling it Catholic, Single, and Flourishing. The goal of the series is to help you as Catholic singles live your God-inspired calling, your vocation today, but also pave a path for the future. So feel free to check out this episode, check out the description in the show notes below, look for the links for the new podcasts and ways that you can connect with me, and also check out a free resource. It's an ebook that I wrote about helping Catholic singles break the cycle of pressure and inaction. With that, here we go with the episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 8th Day Coaching Podcast. Just as a reminder, we are continuing our series on Catholic, Single, and Flourishing, with the whole idea behind this podcast helping Catholic singles, especially those who kind of experience a state of perpetual singleness, flourish. And the idea with all this is helping Catholic singles live their vocation today, live their God-inspiring calling today, and pave a pathway towards the future. So I think a lot of people in this state experience a sense of, oh, my life is on hold. But I really want to be able to coach you wherever you are right now and coach you in the here and now, but also pave a pathway towards where you might feel God is calling you in the long term. So as we continue today, I'm going to be diving into my own story and how I've persevered in my own single life. Really, I want to be journeying with you as a coach, as a Catholic singles coach here. I want you to be able to understand where I'm coming from, what sort of value that I can provide to you, what sort of insights that have come along the way, and really why I'm coaching in this area. And I think that's going to be clear as I go through my own story. I'm confident that you're going to be able to relate to parts of the story. I also understand that everybody has their own unique stories, their own unique challenges. And what I really want to help you with is just identifying what are those virtues, what are those key virtues that you're seeing, whether it's through my story or other people's stories, and how is it that you can grow in those virtues in your own life. And I'm confident that also I'm going to be sharing in the second part of this episode, there's certain insights, 7 insights that I'm sharing in the second part of things that I've learned along the way as a single person and in my own dating experiences that I think are going to be certainly applicable for you wherever you're coming from. So again, I don't know if you're single listening to the podcast. I hope that you can recognize yourself in these sorts of things. And even if you're married, I still encourage you to listen to this because maybe you can share these insights with your friends or share this podcast with your friends as well. So getting into my story a little bit, I have always had a strong inclination towards marriage and a strong desire for marriage. Having grown up in a family where my parents were married and I had an older sister, it was kind of like the American dream all up until they ended up separating. They ended up getting divorced when I was 7 years old. That was a big blow to me, but I remember from that early age, very early on, I was asking that question of, well, how can I avoid this in my future? How can I avoid divorce in my future? And instead of running from marriage, which I think a lot of people in our culture do, I wanted to see what really made a strong marriage. So I remember from my middle school, high school years, I was asking different people who I saw had successful marriages, what were some of those things that were very helpful? And a lot of times they would say communication. It was just kind of this general sense of, communication. That was certainly a big factor in helping us live the marriage that we are living right now. And while I definitely believe that is a big factor, I think one story really stuck out for me. And it was one of my youth group leaders. He and his wife had been married for 25, 30 years or something. And he said a couple of things. He said, being aligned with your spouse on how many children you want, being aligned on the relationships with your in-laws, being aligned with your finances, being aligned in your faith. Those were those sorts of things. Like I remember that just as a 15 or 16-year-old hearing those sorts of things. And I remembered that, and I've kind of remembered those as time has gone on. But I think that last one that he mentioned, faith, being aligned in faith, was such a big one. And that was a seed that was planted in my heart just as a high school student. And as I started continuing to move forward in my life into my college years, that seed really sprouted and blossomed. And I went to Oregon State University my freshman year, got invited to this retreat, had a very transformative experience. One, being able to address the healings of my wounds, my family wounds in the past, but moving beyond that and having a conversation a little bit more on why prayer and why faith is important in these types of relationships, and also why natural family planning as opposed to artificial contraception is also so fundamental for keeping a marriage together. Whole nother podcast episode. I'm going to leave that to the married couples to really cover. That's not my domain, at least at this point in my life. But at the same time, while I was learning those things on an intellectual level, I was also learning how not to date. There was a situation that came up in my college years. I was texting a female friend of mine who I was kind of interested in, and I wanted to, hang out, and I'm using those air quotes. So for those of you who are listening, instead of watching the YouTube video here, but I was wanting to hang out, and we were going to go grab lunch, and I remember showing up to her place. She opens the door, and she's wearing this nice, beautiful dress, and there I am, just as like this random college student dude showing up in my sweatpants and a hoodie. And yeah, I just kind of played it off of like, not knowing this, but it definitely felt like an awkward thing. But that kind of gives you an idea of where I was starting from. And in fact, I didn't even own a pair of jeans at that point in my life. And eventually I mentioned the seed of faith being planted and growing and taking steps forward there. One of the things that I felt really called to do was become a missionary. So previously I had been trying to build this life throughout my collegiate years of working in sports. And I was very successful in just kind of moving up the ladder, but I felt God called me out of that into mission work. And one of the stops along the way was the Culture Project. I became a Culture Project missionary, and the community was so supportive and so helpful, especially in my formation in learning about dating and learning about how to date. So I bought a pair of jeans and really started practicing these different dating tips that they would give me along the way, and found that was just such a very important formative time in my life. And during that time, I think a lot of the narrative around this was, hey, you have a duty as a man to ask women out. And I think that there's some truth to this. I also think that sometimes it can create some sort of pressure or unnecessary anxiety. I think there's a good healthy pressure that can push us forward, but sometimes, especially when there's a lot of pretty faithful women around us, it just can be a sense of you just got to do this. You just got to do this. And it kind of takes the heart out of the matter. But anyway, I would do a lot of what I was being told. You got to ask this girl out and say the word date when you ask her out. And when you go on a date, you give her the best view, or you put your back towards the TVs. I think these are all very helpful tips. And what I was learning was, all right, here's dating etiquette. And I was pushing the buttons of dating etiquette. And I even remember there's one point too. It's like you create the dates around her interests. I think that's a very helpful tip. I did this one time where one date I took this girl out. She mentioned that she liked those books, Sideways Stories from Wayside School. They're as kids, they're just hilarious books. And if you have children in your life, like godchildren or nephews or nieces, I recommend those books. Just incredible. It's the same author who wrote Holes. I digress on getting into that, but they're just silly stories. They're just so fun. And I remember her mentioning that on one date. And so I created this whole other date where I took her out to dinner, and then we went to a bookstore afterwards, and we read that book, Sideways Stories from Wayside School. We read these different snippets and these different chapters and just enjoyed those times. But it was at the end of the date when she said to me that, hey, I've just been thinking about this, and I don't see things going forward between us. And that broke my heart. Poor Chad here. But I had been going on several different first dates up to that point, and really thought, hey, there was something here. But the thing was, I had to learn a lesson there. And one of the lessons was, it's not just about pushing buttons when it comes to dating. There's definitely a human element where you learn who you might connect with and really, really connect with. And you may want it more than she does, and whatever at that point. But that started this process of me kind of understanding there's more to it than pushing buttons here. These are human beings that we're dating. And during this time, Culture Project, just like Focus, if you're familiar with Focus, both of these in your first year as a missionary, you take a dating fast. And then after the dating fast, you enter into this whole world of Catholic dating. And I remember I probably went on 10 first dates in the first 18 months, first year and a half of my dating fast, and didn't end up getting into a relationship. I was meeting women in all sorts of areas, from young adult events to TOB courses, theology of the body courses, to other things like focus conferences and so on, and just wasn't really making any progress there, or didn't feel like I was making any progress there. And I think that experience, the one that I just shared, and just kind of trying, maybe take a step back and think, hey, I want something a little bit more natural to bloom. But at the same time, I also know that I can't just rely on that and just rely on things to happen. I still need to take action. I still need to take steps forward. I ended up going to move from Philly to move to Denver, getting my degree at the Augustine Institute, still kept trying to go out with women along the way. And 2 years later, I really experienced a profound call to be a missionary once again, and be a missionary with focus this time. And at the time I was 28, and I understood what I was getting myself into. I understood that, hey, this potentially could slow down my pursuit of marriage, but I also recognize that this is God's call for my life right now. And I think that's a very important thing for us as singles to remember, is the primary thing that we need to be doing is pursuing God's will. Even if we desire to be married and we think that that's God's will for us, I think figuring out what is God calling me to today, in today's day and age, and what's the advantage that he's giving to me as a single person. I had some really incredible experiences, so many good friendships that I made as a focus missionary when I was at George Mason University out near the Washington, D.C. area, Fairfax, Virginia. And then also when I was at Washington State University, I was a team director out there at Washington State University, and there's just some really incredible, profound encounters with students, and being able to walk with students, help them grow in their leadership and faith. One of which I'm just very amazed that God worked in the way that he did. I ran a Bible study for the football team at Washington State. So there were several football players that came together. This was also during the time of COVID, where nothing else was happening. And so we were still meeting over Zoom when we were having these Bible studies. And a lot of those friendships are just so profound. I still have many of those friendships today. A couple of the guys ended up in the NFL. And it's just awesome to reflect on those experiences and just to think about, well, the way that God has led me, just pursuing his will, even amidst being in this tiny little town of Pullman, Washington, being so isolated from dating opportunities. I really recognize that, okay, this is what God wanted for me in this time. And amidst all of that, I think a lot of times it's easy for us to be thinking, okay, my life is on hold as a single person. But the truth of the matter is that you can't just wait. You can't wait to start living. You have to live today. And that's one of the points of emphasis that I have, is helping young adult Catholic singles live their vocation, their God-inspired calling today, but also paving a path for the future as well. But I want to help you within this podcast series of living that God-inspired calling today, or your vocation today. And you don't have to wait until you're married or until you have this beam of light given to you from God of, hey, this is what you need to be doing. Sometimes you got to live that. And amidst all this, doing all these different things, going to grad school, going to be a missionary at the age of 28, once again, and so on, I was experimenting and meeting different people in different ways. I think one of the things that inspired me was Dr. Henry Cloud's book, How to Get a Date Worth Keeping. I highly recommend that book. I still think it's very relevant for today's day and age, especially almost 20 years after he wrote the book. One of the things that it encouraged me was being proactive in the way that I was meeting people. And so I would take some of his tips to mind, really with the understanding that I've learned that there's no silver bullet. There's no magic formula to being able to have a spouse, but being able to be proactive in how we meet people, and how we also learning in those interactions, what do we think about ourselves in our situation? How do we need to grow in those situations, in becoming a more courageous person, or becoming a more receptive or proactive person, or however it is. So I would meet many different women during different avenues, like dating apps or mutual friends setting me up with somebody. Even I tried speed dating at one point in time as well. And I think up to this point, I probably asked out around 40 different women in whatever capacity, and gone out on 30 first dates with all these different women. And now I don't, people usually have different reactions to this. I don't know if this is high or low compared to your experience. I tend to get very different reactions where, oh my gosh, Chad, that's so many people. And others who are like, oh, that's 30. That's not that much. But yeah, I tend to get these different reactions, and I'd love to actually hear, whether it's your experience or friends that you've known, what they say that their numbers are. And understandably, some of these numbers might be over exaggerated. I don't think that 30 first dates is something I'm over exaggerating on. And I don't mean to belabor this point, but my whole thought here on this is that everybody's experience is very unique. So it's not so much about the numbers here. Some people, I know many of my college friends just dated one or two or three people before they ended up getting married shortly after college. And other people have really spent time with in and out of short relationships and so on. And so all of our experiences in terms of the situations might be different. But I think we have common difficulties when it comes to relationships in terms of really not gaining momentum, not gaining the momentum that we want when it comes to dates. So with that, I think the point I want to draw out of that is it's all a learning process. And that's really where we're going to eventually get me sharing my 7 insights here. But it's all a learning process along the way. Even when relationships don't work out, you're learning lessons. And in particular, there was one situation, one person who I was dating over the course of several months. And it was honestly the most natural progression that I've had over the course of these several months. I did, in fact, meet her on a dating app. So even the meeting itself, us meeting up for the first time, it wasn't the most natural thing. But I really learned a lot there in terms of what I desire or what I want when I'm looking for a person or a relationship. And we saw each other, as I said, over several months. It didn't work out for a few reasons, but that I'm not going to get into in this episode. But ultimately, my experience there and previous experiences were helpful in identifying, all right, this is the type of friendship that I'm looking for when I'm dating and moving towards marriage. And this is the type of relationship that I want to have. I also know that there's these other situations where I've asked 40 different women out on dates over the last, I don't know, decade or so. And I'm learning the virtue of courage. I found there's different times where it is still as difficult as that first time that I asked somebody out. And other times where it's like, hey, that was actually very casual and very, very simple. So I still go through this ebbs and flows. I'm not perfect at this. And I think that's part of my point when it comes to teaching about this, is that I'm still experiencing this. And that's one of the unique values that I offer as a coach, is I'm still living in this. I may not be, having 10 years of marriage experience, but I can speak to the longing and the desire and the wandering and the pressure that it's like to be a single in his 30s in today's day and age. So all of that being said, I have this whole personal experience, and amidst all this personal experience, I also have leadership coaching experience. A lot of what I've been doing is coaching small business owners, coaching people in their time management, coaching people in their personal finances. And really, I think a lot of people think coaching is just advice giving, but the truth is it's not advice giving. I'm not here to give you advice, but simply point out observations or insight that might be helpful for your life. I'm also here to help you recognize what challenges, what difficulties, what problems are in your way of where you really want to go, and then helping free you up to give you the action, or help you realize what action you want to take to move things forward. So right now, again, I'm taking this leadership and business coaching experience that I've had. I'm adding it into my own personal experiences, my own experiences in single life and dating, and putting that together. And really, I'm coaching you as Catholic singles to wherever you desire to go. I've also done some research groups where I pulled together Catholic singles, late 20s into their 30s and so on, and just interviewing them about their experiences and their desires. So I add that into the mix as well. So this isn't just coming from my own personal experience. And throughout all that, I learned these certain lessons. And that's where I'm going to shift from my story and now into the top 7 insights Again, not advice, but the top 7 insights that I've learned in my own dating life, in my own single life, that I think might be helpful for you gaining perspective and taking steps forward in your own life. Number one is how we live our single years is how we are going to live our vocation. I remember there was this time when I was living at a seminary. I wasn't in seminary myself, but I was living in a seminary as a missionary with a number of seminarians, and I was in a homily, and I think it was the feast day of St. Joseph, actually. And I'm sitting there listening to the priest, and he told the men there at the seminary, how you live your seminary life is how you will live your priesthood. Really what he was referring to is the habits that you develop here in seminary are ultimately going to impact how you live your priesthood. And I thought, wow, that's really profound. And that really related to me as a missionary, the habits, the friendships, the relationships that I build in my missionary life. The things that I do there are ultimately going to play out in how I live in my vocation, in my desired vocation of marriage and so on. And I think that's so true about our single life. Are we living as if our life is on hold? Are we living in a way where we're planning for the future and we're preparing for the future? Are we living in a way where we're learning how to navigate conflict? Because even, especially something like that, is those habits end up playing a role in our vocation and as we move into our vocation. And one of the things that I learned in that, and I've heard it a number of times, is that we're all in marriage prep right now. If you are single, you're in marriage prep right now, or you're preparing for your religious vocation or what have you. That even if we're not engaged in a formal marriage prep program or in a dating course or something like that formally, everything that we're doing, the virtue that we're building or the vices that we're building are either moving us to a stronger marriage or moving us away. Going back to what I talked about, this is one thing that grew out of my desire to be married and stay married from a young age, is kind of learning these insights, learning these bits of information, that it is our growth, the opportunities that God gives us to grow along the way, shape us for who we are going to become when we get to that point in our vocation. Number 2, I must learn to embrace my single years. All right, I know that that's a pretty basic insight. I must learn to embrace my single years. Number 1, I do want to acknowledge that there is a true ache, there is a true longing, there's a true loneliness when it comes to being single. And I think that we need to be able to acknowledge that and recognize that that's certainly a normal thing. And also, at the same time, we also need to learn how to love who the person God has created us to be. Because the advantage of that is, as we in our single years might go years without being in a dating relationship or moving towards marriage, we need to learn the value that we bring, whether it be to a relationship or just in our lives, the way that God is shaping us. Because as we learn who we are, as we learn the gift of who we are, that makes it possible for us to give a gift of ourselves in marriage. And that's what marriage is all about, is being able to be that gift of self to somebody else. So we have to recognize, we have to gain an awareness of the gift that we are in order to be able to give that gift in a most full way. And I want to point out too that this is not, embracing our single years. It's not a desire. It's not a denial of our desire to be married, but being able to see the opportunities in our lives right now, whether that's, hey, I want to get into a better financial situation and pay off the debt, so when I enter into marriage, it's not a burden on the relationship. Or there's these hobbies that I desire to grow in, learning to play the guitar, learning to rock climb, or whatever it is. And this could be opportunities to either meet people or just invite somebody into. Then also, I think, as I've mentioned before, as Christians, there's even a further call. We're all called to be on mission. And as single people, we have time that our married friends do not, to be able to serve the Lord in that way. And again, going back to what I said before, some of those profound experiences with the Culture Project, with my time at George Mason with Focus, and then Washington State, being able to have some friendships with a couple of guys in the NFL. I mean, those are just so profound, so profound that I wouldn't have had time had I gotten married at, 25 years old. So, okay, so that's number 2, is learning how to embrace your single years. Number 3, this is a very profound point here. Jesus himself, Jesus was 30 before he entered his vocation. He entered his full-time ministry. I think that this is very profound. You can look this up. You can see this. Luke 3:23 says that Jesus was about 30 years old when he started his ministry. And this really hit me hard because I was praying and meditating upon the hidden life of Christ, the hidden life, which is those 30 years before he enters ministry. All we see is really him 12 years old in the temple, being, lost in the temple there. But at the time, I was probably 27 years old and 5 months or some change like that, and feeling the ache of single life and realizing Jesus was 27 and 7 years old and 5 months at one point in his life. But he was doing his thing. He was working. He was working as oftentimes people say a carpenter, but he was doing his manual labor. And he hadn't even entered into his vocation, into his ministry at this point. I just find that so profound that we in our 20s and then into our 30s, Jesus hadn't even began his vocation. It changes our perspective a little bit. And then even further, Jesus died at 33. So he didn't even live a long, full life that I think a lot of us really aspire to. So he was entering into his vocation, 90% of his life being over. I just find that very profound. And that changes. That changes how we look at the world, because the world has certain standards, but I think also the Catholic world and the Christian world has standards of getting married in your 20s. And we can't always accomplish that. But I think seeing Jesus' life in perspective can help us feel not as rushed, because he wasn't in a rush to get into his ministry and into his vocation. Number 4, I realize how little control over what happens in my life, but God always encourages me to take ownership over my life. All right, I realize how little control I have over what happens in my life. I think there's a dream that we have in American culture, which is you get married, you have healthy relationships, you have good relationships, whatever. You get married, you have kids, and then you grow old together and spend decades together, and you have this happily ever after life. But in reality, life is a lot more complicated. And my life was really shaken when I lost a good friend of mine. He was 29 years old at the time. He died in a car accident. He had just been married for about 2 years up to that point. They didn't have any kids. But it shocked me that somebody that young could die. That story, that fairy tale ending could get interrupted. And oftentimes, this is the case, that life is not drawn up in a way that we choose. And I think that's a very specific, tragic case of death. And that's certainly not the norm, but those things can happen. But I think we might have this script for our lives. We might have this desired blueprint for our lives. But God doesn't always cooperate with that blueprint. And I think it's all about us being able to cooperate with his blueprint in our lives. Sometimes we get married later. I know several people who are very influential figures in my life who got married in their mid-30s or late 40s or however it is. And that was just the plan that God drew up for them. And so those are very beautiful things. We don't recognize it as we're walking through this time of being single. But God has that plan. And I think a big part of this is just being able to hope and trust in God's plan and hope for a brighter future. Because the truth of the matter is that, I know you probably know this, there's other tragedies that happen. I mentioned my friend passing away. There's broken engagements. There's people who get divorced that you were like, wait, I thought you had a good marriage and family life and a strong faith. How did that happen? So I think the big thing here is really just trusting God's plan and keeping a life of prayer and moving according to his will. Number 5, rejection is a normal part of dating. Rejection is a normal part of dating. All right. Our mindset around rejection is often skewed. We have Hollywood, which portrays the happily ever after. People just kind of fall in love and then they, may have difficulty in a relationship at one point, but then they get together and it all is happy and it all works out. Or we see our college friends, maybe they date just a couple of people in college and then find the love of their life and get married. No disrespect to any of those stories. I think those stories can be very, very inspiring for us. But one of the things is sometimes we internalize that their story should be our story. And rejection in dating is something that is an abnormal thing. It was interesting. I went out on a date with somebody recently, and one of the things that she said, she just praised me for my courage in being willing to ask her out. She said that in handling rejection, because she eventually said, it's not going to work out. She said that, I just really appreciate how you receive that, because a lot of times, when I turn down a guy, they just seem absolutely crushed. And I think that that's the common experience, is that we build this story up in our mind that, all right, found a pretty girl, I'm going to ask her out, and she's going to say yes, and we're going to live happily ever after. We build these stakes up in our minds so quickly. And when she rejects us, then we just feel so absolutely crushed. But the truth of the matter is, especially when it comes to young adult dating, rejection is normal. It's normal for relationships to not work out. And that, I think, is a very profound and fundamental point that we need to be navigating, that dating is learning about. Number one, who are we looking for? What are the qualities in this person that I really want to be married to, somebody who has these qualities? Even if it's not that person, I'm learning that. But two is handling rejection as well. Because the truth of the matter is, more people go on dates with people that they're going to get married to. I don't know, did that make any sense? You're going to go on more dates, and you learn, one, how to handle rejection, and you also learn what type of person you're looking for in the process. And you're only going to marry one of them, but you may end up dating 100 in order to get to that point. All right, rejection is a normal part of dating. It's a normal part of the process. Number 6, the more we suffer in single life, the more we realize that marriage is a complete gift from God. There is this culture of entitlement, I think, when it comes to relationships. And a lot of times we just feel entitled that, hey, God should just give me this relationship, or I should just have this relationship because I deserve this. But the truth of the matter is, especially when you face all this rejection, and as you continue to work through your loneliness, the ache as a single person, the frustration, what that comes with being single, is you remember these moments in your life, so that when marriage does come along, you realize how much of a gift that person is in your life, and how much of a gift that marriage is. And I think especially as you move into your 30s, that you have these experiences accumulated. You realize how much a gift marriage is, that in a way that maybe somebody who got married in their early 20s may not, because they didn't have those struggles. So number 6 is that the more we suffer in our single life, the more we realize that marriage is a complete gift. It is a privilege. And finally, number 7, we seek not simply marriage, but we seek a purpose, a God-inspired purpose. This comes from a lot of my research and having a lot of conversations with people, that I think a lot of people, a lot of singles, when they say they want to get married, a lot of times more deeply, they're looking for a sense of purpose. They see over and they look at other couples having their relationship, having their family, and what they see is that those people have a sense of purpose. They may or may not. Sometimes married couples don't have a sense of purpose in their marriage, but I think singles can often assume that's my purpose and that's where I need to be. But the truth of the matter is that today, you can understand God's calling and God's purpose for you now. You don't have to wait for some point in the future that is vague and uncertain, but you can start living your God-inspired calling now. It may not be in a relationship or in a dating relationship. Marriage may be a number of years off. Who knows? But God is calling you to something right now. And that, I think, is so important for you as a Catholic single, or even as a married person, to recognize what is God's specific purpose for you today. And that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this series on Catholic single and flourishing, is I really want to coach singles to live their vocation, their God-inspired calling, their God-inspired purpose today, but also pave a path for the future. So those are some of my insights. I have plenty more that I could share with you, but I also want to hear from you. What insights do you have from your single life that may be helpful for others? I know I'm going to be posting this on social media, so some of the conversations can start there. I want to hear what your insights are. How can you inspire others? Yeah, so go ahead and post in the comments, and please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts if that's your preferred platform. Now, getting into a little bit more of what I offer you, again, I mentioned I'm a coach, and I'm applying leadership coaching to coaching Catholic singles, especially those who experience that they are perpetually single, or they experience the state of perpetual singleness. And of course, my number one qualification is that I'm going through this right now. I experienced this. I have this whole track record, and that's why I wanted to share with you just the story of my own experience, because I hope it resonated with you and you can learn from this as well. And again, talking about helping you live your vocation today, but also prepare a path for the future. I'm here as a resource. In this podcast, I'm going to be talking about different things from the short term dating strategies, dating practicals, and those sorts of things. I'm also going to be talking about longer term things, such as financial coaching. I'm a Dave Ramsey certified coach, financial coach, and it led me to this point now where I was able to buy a house in Denver. It's a modest townhome. Took me 5 years to save up to get to this point, and even as a missionary and a grad student, I was able to get to this point. And that's something that I want to invite you in if that's something you want to consider in terms of financial coaching. So I do one-on-one coaching, I do small group coaching, so if you want to get a group together, we could have a conversation on what that might look like. And ultimately, I want to make it as easy as possible for you to take the next step here. So aside from listening to this podcast, I have a free resource for you. It's a free ebook, and it's on breaking the cycle of pressure and inaction. I think the common experience that I found in a lot of the research groups that I was conducting was people felt a sense of pressure from their friends, pressure from the world, pressure from all sorts of sources that were telling them they had to get their life in order now, or they had to do X, Y, or Z when it comes to dating and marriage. It was just that common experience of pressure that I really wanted to address with this ebook. It's a short ebook, and there's a place for you to kind of write in, whether it's notes or actually participate in exercises and activities. So really breaking that cycle of pressure, and the pressure oftentimes keeps us immobilized. It keeps us from taking action. So I want to help free you up so you can take the action that helps you to actually move forward in your life and towards your vocation. So that's one resource. I also want to point to two other resources as we're wrapping up here. Number one is you can check out some of my story earlier if you want. Deeper version of my faith journey and my coaching journey is in episode 2B. It was the bonus episode on my hero's journey. And that's tied into something I would really encourage you to listen to, which is episode 2, which is you are the hero of your own journey. Of course, God is really the main hero, but you are the one who cooperates with him in your life, and that's episode 2 there. And secondly, coming up, I will be posting this on my podcast, but the first time it's going to be posted, this episode, will be on the Seek podcast. The Focus Conference, the annual Focus Conference, is coming up in January 2nd through the 6th this year in St. Louis, Missouri. And I had the privilege of recording an episode of the podcast for the Seek conference. So that will be accessible on the Seek podcast. I will list all of these resources for you in the show notes and want to encourage you to check that out. I'm sharing a little bit more of my own story. The episode is 4 lessons that I learned from going on a date at Seek. So I dive into the actual experience of going on a date at a conference from somebody who I just met kind of randomly at the Seek conference, and then some of the lessons that I learned from that. So if you want to check that out, keep an eye out for that. Keep a look at the links in the show notes. And as we wrap up here, I just want to encourage you, if you've been listening to the podcast, to also check out the videos on YouTube. I'm putting in some effort in there to build up a YouTube channel. So if you watch YouTube more so than you listen to podcasts, that's available for you as well. And branching out in the areas of social media as well, giving Instagram a try in all that. And also, I wanted to mention too with that ebook, you can, and I'll put a link in the show notes, you can check out CatholicSinglesSolutions.com, and that's where you can find that free version of the ebook. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the 8th Day Coaching Podcast. It was a great heart-to-heart that I was able to share with you my own story and some of the insights that I've learned over the course of time. Be sure to live inspired. Live God-inspired. Thank you for watching this episode of the 8th Day Coaching Podcast. Be sure to like and subscribe on this YouTube channel, and check the description down below for any free offerings that I have, like my ebook on breaking the cycle of pressure and inaction for Catholic singles. Also, feel free to check out our other offerings at 8thdaycoaching.com.